He was the king of silence, the apex predator of the city's concrete canyons. Tonight, his reign was being weighed in blood as a ghost from the old country stepped out of the shadows to humiliate him. The air in the room didn't just feel cold. It felt expensive, heavy with the scent of $1,000 scotch and impending violence. Men who controlled entire shipping lanes sat paralyzed, afraid to even blink. Then, she moved. The waitress, the one who was nothing more than part of the furniture. She didn't just approach the table, she walked into the line of fire. When she opened her mouth, it wasn't to offer a refill. She spoke the keep de gi, the jagged, forgotten tongue of the 1970s Busan docks. With one sentence, she didn't just stop a war, she dismantled a dynasty. Who is the girl from Detroit who speaks like a dead Busan king? And what is the secret hanging around her neck? This isn't just a story about the underworld. It's a resurrection. The lounge was called the Obsidian, a fortress of glass and shadow tucked away where the sunlight couldn't reach. It was a place where the city's elite paid for the privilege of disappearing. Tech moguls and governors sat in leather booths, yet they all knew they were guests in another man's house. Lee Hyun-tae was that man. He was carved from obsidian himself, sharp, dark, and impenetrable. In his custom black suit, he sat at the center table like a deity of the new world, his presence radiating a gravity that pulled everyone toward him. He was the modern face of the syndicate, a man who had traded the rough blades of his ancestors for the cold precision of a scalpel. The obsidian wasn't just his business, it was his court. Then there was Naomi. In this gilded cage of power, Naomi Brooks was a ghost. At 24, she possessed a striking, quiet beauty that she masked behind the rigid professionalism of her red and white uniform. To the mobsters, she was background noise, a girl who delivered drinks and cleared glass without ever making eye contact. For Naomi, the invisibility was a weapon. Every tipsy confession she overheard and every coded glance she caught was a stone in her fortress. She needed the tips, but more importantly, she needed the silence. She was a girl with a Detroit heart and a Busan soul, hiding a dragon seal beneath her collar that could set the city on fire. She was saving for an escape, but tonight, her past finally caught up to her. The obsidian throne was less a chair and more a manifestation of Lee Hyun-tae's soul, jagged, unyielding, and forged in the dark. From the top floor of the Taeyong Heights, the city of Seoul looked like a collection of glass toys, easily crushed. Hyun-tae sat in the silence of his office, the only sound the rhythmic, predatory tap of his signet ring against the mahogany desk. His rule was not built on charisma, but on the terrifying efficiency of a man who had excised his own heartbeat to make room for cold ambition. To his subordinates, he was a ghost in a bespoke suit. To his enemies, he was the inevitable end. 3 floors below, in the velvet-shrouded quiet of the Golden Lotus Lounge, Naomi moved like a flicker of candlelight against the shadows. She had mastered the art of being invisible. In a world populated by power-hungry titans and their shimmering mistresses, Naomi was merely the girl who replenished the crystal decanters and adjusted the silk cushions. She kept her head down, her movements fluid and silent, ensuring the atmosphere remained undisturbed. To the elite who frequented the lounge, she was part of the furniture, a necessary, nameless utility. It was a lonely existence, but a safe one. Naomi found a strange comfort in her anonymity. By fading into the background, she could observe the cracks in the masks of the powerful. She saw the sweat on a CEO's brow before a hostile takeover. She heard the desperate whispers of heirs who had gambled away their futures. She knew their secrets, and yet they never truly saw her. The divide between the throne room and the lounge felt like a vast, unbridgeable canyon. Hyun-tae commanded the world from his heights, while Naomi survived in the margins. However, even the most perfect shadow depends on the light above it. As the elevator chimes echoed through the marble hallway, signaling a rare descent from the top floor, the practiced stillness of the lounge fractured. The air grew heavy, charged with the kind of ozone that precedes a violent storm. Naomi felt the hair on her arms rise. She didn't need to look up to know that the master of the obsidian throne had decided to step into the light. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a deliberate, rhythmic thud that silenced the room instantly. Chairman O did not enter so much as he occupied the space. his presence a cold front moving across a summer landscape. He bypassed the empty seat saved for him at the head of the table, opting instead to lean against the mahogany surface directly opposite Hyun-tae. Hyun-tae kept his expression a mask of practiced indifference, though the slight tightening of his grip on his fountain pen betrayed him. "Chairman Oh," he said, his voice steady. "We weren't expecting you until the final vote." Oh offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a thin, brittle expression that looked like a crack in porcelain. He adjusted the silk pocket square in his charcoal suit, his movements slow and agonizingly precise. "I found myself reflecting on the nature of stewardship this morning, Hyun-tae." Oh began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that commanded every ear in the room. "My grandfather used to say that a kingdom is rarely lost to a conqueror. More often, it is lost to a gardener who mistakes the sun's warmth for his own brilliance." A heavy, suffocating silence descended. The directors looked down at their tablets, suddenly fascinated by spreadsheets. The insult was draped in the finery of an anecdote, but its edge was razor-sharp. Hyun-tae was not the architect of this success. He was merely the hired help who had grown arrogant while tending to someone else's soil. "The quarterly projections suggest otherwise, Chairman," Hyun-tae replied, his tone chilling a few degrees. "The growth we've seen is the result of structural evolution, not mere maintenance." Oh chuckled, a dry sound like dead leaves skittering on pavement. He stepped closer, invading Hyun-tae's personal space until the scent of expensive sandalwood and stale tobacco was overwhelming. He placed a heavy hand on Hyun-tae's shoulder, a gesture that looked paternal to an outsider but felt like a lead weight. "Growth is a chaotic thing, boy. Left unchecked, a vine will strangle the very oak that supports it. And we all know what happens to a vine when the oak decides it has had enough." Oh patted his shoulder twice, a dismissive, infantilizing gesture, and turned to the room. "Continue with your report. I'm curious to see just how much of my foundation you've managed to obscure with your decorations." As Oh took his seat, the power dynamic in the room shifted visibly. The air felt thinner. Hyun-tae realized that the battle for the company was no longer about profit margins or dividends. It was a war of blood and ego, and the chairman had just drawn first blood. The air in the warehouse thickened with the scent of brine and old oil. Oh stood over Hyun-tae, his laughter a jagged sound that grated against the corrugated metal walls. He had cornered the younger man, peeling back Hyun-tae's dignity with the precision of a fishmonger's blade. The gang gathered around, their silence a predatory wait, waiting for the final snap of humiliation. Then, Naomi moved. She didn't rush in. She drifted into the center of the circle like a scrap of silk caught in a gale. The Busan butterfly was a name usually whispered in reverence of her grace, but as she stopped inches from Oh, her eyes held the cold, gray light of the Sea of Japan in winter. When she spoke, the voice that emerged wasn't the polished, melodic tone of a tea-house performer. It was a low, rhythmic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. She spoke the Gwangbok-dong gutter slang, the jagged, rhythmic tongue of the 1950s dockworkers. It was a dialect of survivors, thieves, and salt-stained ghosts, a language O's polished underworld ego wasn't prepared to handle. "You're barking like a dog with a throat full of hooks." "Oh," she said, the words sliding out with a lethal, rhythmic tilt. She used a specific slur for a man who steals from his own mother's rice bowl, a term so archaic and biting it made the older men in the back of the room flinch. She turned her gaze to the floor, where Hyun-tae sat, and then back to Oh, her lip curling in a way that signaled his insignificance. She painted him, in 3 sharp sentences, as a dryland barnacle, someone who clung to the hulls of real ships because he was too weak to float on his own. She mocked his lineage, tracing his arrogance back to a father who sold salted mackerel for copper coins, stripping away the veneer of his current power until he looked like nothing more than a frightened boy in a borrowed suit. The men began to mumble. The power dynamic shifted like a tide. By making Oh the target of such ancient, expert ridicule, the spotlight moved away from Hyun-tae's failure. Naomi hadn't just defended him. She had sucked all the oxygen out of the room, leaving Oh gasping in the vacuum of his own embarrassment. Hyun-tae looked up, his breathing steadying as he watched the feared boss wither under the weight of Naomi's tongue. She reached down, offering a hand not out of pity, but with the casual authority of a queen reclaiming a knight. As they turned to leave, the silence that followed was no longer a threat. It was the stunned quiet of a harbor after a storm. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing the sound of the bustling palace corridors away and leaving only the rhythmic tick of a pendulum clock to fill the silence. Hyun-tae didn't sit. He paced the length of his private office, his silhouette cutting a sharp, restless figure against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the city lights of Seoul twinkled like fallen stars, but inside, the air was thick with a tension that felt almost combustible. "Sit," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that brooked no argument. He finally turned, his gaze locking onto Naomi with an intensity that seemed to strip away her defenses layer by layer. He didn't look like a king in this moment. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered a mystery he couldn't solve. He leaned against the edge of his mahogany desk, crossing his arms over his chest. "I have spent my entire life learning to read people, Naomi," he began, his tone deceptively soft. "I can spot a lie in a diplomat's smile and a tremor in a general's hand. But you are a ghost in my own palace. You move through these halls with a grace that wasn't learned in a week of etiquette classes, and you look at me with eyes that have seen far more than a simple girl from the provinces should have." Naomi kept her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white. She tried to steady her breathing, but the sheer weight of his presence made the room feel small. "I am exactly who my records say I am, Your Majesty," she whispered, though the words felt hollow even to her. Hyun-tae let out a short, mirthless laugh. He took a step toward her, invading her personal space until she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. The scent of cedarwood and cold rain clung to him. "The records say you are a cipher. No childhood friends, no digital footprint before 3 years ago, and a pedigree that smells of fresh ink and desperation. Who are you really?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate crawl. "Are you a gift from my enemies? A spy meant to find the cracks in my foundation? Or are you something else entirely?" The silence stretched, taut and vibrating like a wire about to snap. Naomi felt the urge to spill everything. The fear, the secrets, the truth of why she was really there, bubbling up in her throat. His curiosity wasn't just a royal whim. It was a fire, and she was standing right in the center of the hearth. "Tell me the truth," he pressured, his dark eyes searching hers for a single flicker of honesty. "Give me one reason to trust that you aren't the most beautiful threat I've ever faced." The transition from the sunlit streets of Seoul to the windowless interior of Hyun-tae's office felt like a physical weight pressing against Naomi's chest. The air here was heavy with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the cold, metallic tang of unspoken threats. She wasn't a prisoner in the traditional sense, but as she sat across from him, adjusting the cuffs of a silk blouse she hadn't bought for herself, the distinction felt academic. "You look uncomfortable, Naomi," Hyun-tae remarked, not looking up from a ledger bound in dark leather. A cultural advisor should embody the grace of the culture she represents. "It's hard to feel graceful when I'm being used as a human encyclopedia for your smuggling routes," Naomi replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her pulse. Hyun-tae finally looked up. His eyes weren't cold. They were worse. They were appreciative, as if she were a particularly interesting piece of porcelain he had just acquired. "Smuggling is a crude word. We are curators of history that the world has seen fit to lock behind red tape. Your job is to ensure that when these artifacts move through the Japanese ports, they carry the correct provenance papers. You know the nuances of the Edo period better than any scholar I've hired. You make the lies feel like truth." He pushed a folder toward her. Inside were photographs of a set of ceremonial tea bowls, exquisite and undoubtedly stolen from a private collection in Kyoto. Naomi felt a sick twist of recognition. She had written her thesis on the kiln that produced these. To touch them, even through a photograph, felt like a betrayal of everything she loved. "I won't help you move these," she whispered. Hyun-tae leaned forward, the shadow of the office's gilded birdcage dancing across his face. "The beauty of our arrangement, Naomi, is that you aren't here to give permission. You are here to provide the narrative. If the papers are wrong, the shipment is seized. If the shipment is seized, my associates become impatient. And when they are impatient, they look for someone to blame. I would hate for that blame to fall on your brother." The mention of Leo was a sharp needle prick. Naomi's hand trembled as she reached for the folder. She realized then that this was the Gilded Shadow, a world where beauty was merely a veneer for brutality, and her own expertise was the silk thread being used to bind her. She began to speak, her voice hollow as she dictated the historical context needed to forge the export permits. Each word felt like a drop of ink staining a clean sheet of paper, pulling her further away from the light and deeper into the velvet darkness of Hyun-tae's empire. The humid night air clung to the balcony, but Hyun-tae barely felt it. His gaze was anchored to the small, silver pendant resting against the hollow of Naomi's throat. As she leaned forward to point out a constellation, the moonlight caught the intricate metalwork, illuminating a coiled dragon clutching a single, teardrop-shaped jade. His breath hitched, a sharp, cold jaggedness tearing through his chest. He knew that dragon. He knew the way the jade was notched at the bottom, a tiny imperfection he'd traced with his thumb 1,000 times in a faded photograph hidden beneath his floorboards. "My mother didn't leave me much," Naomi said, her voice soft, unaware of the sudden stillness that had seized him. "Just this. She told me it was a gift from a man who promised to keep her safe." Hyun-tae's world tilted. For 20 years, his father's death had been a hollow ache, a sacrifice made for a client whose name had been scrubbed from the official records. He had grown up hating the shadow of that woman, blaming the nameless face for the father who never came home. He had imagined her as a monster of selfishness, someone whose life was bought with the blood of a better man. But looking at Naomi now, at the gentle curve of her smile and the way she held herself with a quiet, fragile strength, the hatred felt suddenly, violently misplaced. "Naomi," he whispered, his voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. She turned, her eyes searching his. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." He had. He was seeing the ghost of his father's final choice. The dragon's heirloom wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was the symbol of the debt that had defined his life. His father hadn't died for a stranger or a paycheck. He had died for her mother, and by extension, for the very girl standing in front of him. The irony tasted like copper in his mouth. He had been sent to find her for his own ends, yet he was bound to her by a legacy of blood he was only just beginning to understand. The girl he was supposed to use was the living reason his father was gone. "It's beautiful," he managed to say, though the words felt like glass in his throat. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered just inches from the jade. He didn't touch it. He couldn't. To touch the necklace was to acknowledge that their fates had been intertwined long before they ever met, locked together by a sacrifice that Naomi didn't even know she carried. The chandelier light fractured against the crystal flutes, casting jagged patterns across the ballroom that looked uncomfortably like splattered crimson. Naomi smoothed the silk of her gown, the fabric cool against skin that felt far too hot. To the world, she was a poised debutante, a silent ornament at the side of a man whose name was whispered in fear. But beneath the mask, her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The Blood Moon Gala was an exercise in calculated opulence. Men in tailored tuxedos discussed logistics of death over Wagyu sliders, while women draped in diamonds laughed at jokes that weren't funny. Naomi moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, her chin tilted just high enough to signal a confidence she didn't feel. She knew the rules: smile when spoken to, never look a stranger in the eye for more than 3 seconds, and disappear into the wallpaper when the heavy hitters arrived. But as they neared the velvet-shrouded alcoves where the council sat, the air grew thick with a sudden, suffocating silence. 3 men, their faces etched with the deep lines of decades spent in the shadows, sat in high-backed chairs. The Mafia elders. They were the architects of the city's misery, relics of an era where loyalty was written in veins. As Naomi stepped into their line of sight, the eldest of the 3, a man named Donatello's, froze. His glass stopped inches from his lips. The chatter around them died a slow, awkward death. Naomi felt the weight of their collective gaze. It wasn't the appreciative stare of a lecher, but something sharper, more clinical. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost. Donatello's leaned forward, the light catching the milky film of a cataract in his left eye. "Turn your head," he commanded, his voice a rasping growl that brooked no refusal. Naomi's heart skipped. She obeyed, the movement mechanical. "The jawline," the man beside him whispered, his fingers trembling as they gripped the armrest. And the way she holds her shoulders. It is the same. The exact same as the night at the docks 20 years ago. A cold sweat broke across Naomi's neck. A flash of a memory, one she hadn't invited, ripped through her mind. The smell of salt spray, a woman's scream silenced by a gunshot, and a ring with a sapphire crest. She looked down at her own hands, suddenly terrified that they might see the blood she could still feel on her palms from a life she was supposed to have forgotten. "Who are you?" Donatello's asked, his eyes narrowing into slits. Before she could answer, her escort's hand tightened on her waist, a silent warning that the performance was over and the survival had begun. The sirens didn't scream. They hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the crystal decanters behind the bar. It was the sound of a clean sweep. Chairman O wasn't coming for a negotiation or a warning. He was coming to erase the board. From the mezzanine, Naomi watched the monitors flicker and die one by one as O's private security cut the feeds. The elegant silence of the lounge was shattered by the rhythmic thud of tactical boots against the marble foyer. They were outnumbered 10-1, trapped in a gilded cage that was rapidly becoming a tomb. "He's not leaving anyone alive tonight," Naomi whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She turned to the group, her eyes hard. "The front exits are already braced. If we stay here, we're just targets in a gallery." The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and damp concrete as the first flashbang detonated downstairs. The shockwave blew out the decorative glass partitions, showering the floor in diamond-like shards. Through the smoke, the silhouettes of O's men moved with clinical precision. "Follow me," Naomi commanded, grabbing a heavy brass wall sconce near the back office. She didn't pull it. She twisted it a sharp 45 degrees to the left. With a groan of shifting stone, a section of the wood-paneled wall recessed and slid aside. This wasn't part of the official blueprints. These tunnels were a relic of the building's Prohibition-era bones, a secret kept by the lounge's original owners and passed down through whispers. "Into the dark," she urged, ushering the others into the narrow, chilled passageway just as the doors to the lounge were kicked off their hinges. The tunnel smelled of earth and old copper. As the hidden door clicked shut behind them, the sounds of the assault muffled into a dull thrum. Naomi led the way, her fingers tracing the rough-hewn walls she had memorized years ago. She knew every turn, every dip in the floor, and every rusted ladder that led to the city's underbelly. Chairman O thought he owned the heights of the city, but Naomi knew the shadows. As they descended deeper into the labyrinth, the fear in the group began to shift into a desperate, focused energy. They weren't just escaping, they were disappearing. "Stay close," Naomi breathed, the orange glow of her flashlight cutting through the thick dust. "We're going to come out 3 blocks away. By the time he realizes we aren't in the rubble, we'll be long gone." The smoke of the final confrontation had long since drifted into the gray morning sky, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy. Naomi stood on the balcony of the inner sanctum, her fingers tracing the cold, jagged stone of the railing. For years, she had been a ghost in her own life, sprinting through the shadows to outrun a lineage she never asked for. But as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the fractured city in hues of bruised gold, the urge to run finally withered away. Hyuntae stepped out beside her, his presence a grounding force amidst the exhaustion. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood with her, his cloak torn and his expression weary but resolute. The battle had been won, but the cost was etched into the very streets below. "You're still here," he said softly, his voice gravelly from the night's demands. Naomi turned to look at him, really looking at him, without the veil of secrets that had always sat between them. "I'm tired of looking back, Hyuntae. There's nowhere left to go that isn't forward." In that moment, the weight of their dual inheritance settled upon them, not as a burden, but as a blueprint. They were the bridge between the old world of rigid, blood-soaked traditions and a future that demanded something more. Together, they descended the marble steps to the Great Hall, where the remnants of the High Council and the weary leaders of the rebellion waited in uneasy proximity. There was no grand coronation with gilded baubles. Instead, it was a quiet, solemn transition. They sat not on a singular throne, but as equals before a people who were ready for a change. Naomi spoke first, her voice steady and clear, acknowledging the scars of the past while outlining a modernized empire built on transparency rather than terror. She didn't hide her history, she wore it as armor. Hyun-tae followed, his hand briefly brushing hers on the table. They began the grueling work of dismantling the archaic laws that had stifled their people for generations. It wasn't just a reign, it was a renovation. Under the gaze of two crowns, the empire began to breathe again, shifting from a monument of the past into a living, evolving home. Naomi finally realized that she hadn't been running from her power, but toward the person she needed to be to wield it alongside him.